Some time ago, we ranked every home console from worst to best. Since then, we've been badgered day and night to give similar treatment to every handheld console. Well, you can finally stop knocking on the loo door when I'm trying to have some Ben time, because we're doing it right now.
But first off, what actually is a handheld? It might sound pretty self-explanatory, but some of the devices on this list have stands. Some of them are strapped to your head, and some of them you sit on. You're not supposed to sit on them, but it happens. The point is that handheld is just a term that has stuck. It really refers to portable game consoles that are entirely self-contained, requiring no external displays or controllers. Don't blame me if you don't like the term. I don't like it either. I would have called them electric fun boxes.
So how are we ranking them? More or less the same way we handled the previous list. We'll be considering the size of the console's library, its lifetime sales, its price at launch, the number of years it was officially supported, and the number of games that hold an average of 90% or higher on Metacritic. There are a few notable exclusions we should discuss up front. For starters, no dedicated handhelds. To qualify for this list, the unit needs to be able to play more than its built-in games. Additionally, we won't count anything that requires another device to use, so no Pocket Station, VMU, or e-reader.
We also won't be including handhelds that are designed for emulation. This isn't a legal issue, it's simply because those are a different subject altogether and don't have their own libraries. Oh, and no barcode systems, such as Barcode Battler, scanners, or Tiger barcodes. This is because barcodes are the mark of the beast, and I refuse to go to hell over this list. Finally, we will be combining various versions of what is basically the same system. That is to say, a Game Boy Color is a Game Boy, a DSi is a DS, and a 2DS is a 3DS. Do you hear me, Nintendo? Stop trying to take up more of this list than you already do.
Let's rank them. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from Triple Jump, and this is every video game handheld ranked from worst to best.
Number 67. Grandstand Game Wizard, 1988. I don't know what this is. Peter doesn't know what this is. The guy who wrote this script, I don't know what his name is, but even he doesn't know what this is. We can find exactly one picture of the unit itself. We can find no photographic evidence of a human being occupying the same space as this thing. Did it only exist on another planet? Depending on how you count, the Game Wizard had either 3 releases or 6. Each of the 3 cartridges had a different game on each side. Grandstand as a company released a number of simple LCD units, some of which qualify for this list, most of which do not, and nobody really kept records of them. They were considered disposable at the time, and hindsight certainly hasn't changed that opinion. We tried, dear viewer, really, we tried. We couldn't dig up any information that you can't already see from the images on screen. I'd conclude that the thing never existed, but people do remember playing it. Okay, granted, the only game anyone can remember playing on it is Candle Cove, but still. Number 66. Electronika IM-26, 1988. Don't you miss the days when games consoles had names like IM-26? That's okay, neither do we. It makes research a right pain, especially when there's so little information about a console to begin with. We do know that Electronika was not actually a company, it was a name applied to products built by the Soviet Ministry of the Electronics Industry. If that sounds scary and imposing, it should. Electronika devices were made by the Soviet military-industrial complex for both business and pleasure. And what pleasure! The IM-26 released with a grand total of 3 games, all of which made Game & Watch look like God of War. 4 years later, the Ministry of the Electronics Industry blessed the public with 2 more releases. Hail, Mother Russia! Am I right, guys? Can I get a hail? Let's not do that. The IM-26 and its games were never produced in mass quantities and were not released outside of the USSR, presumably because Disney would have had something to say about Mickey Mouse being used in games produced by the Russian government. Sales figures are not available, but according to the video game Kraken, the most reliable cephalopod when it comes to gaming history, it sold poorly and was abandoned. Somehow, the world kept turning. Number 65. Grandstand Light Games, 1988. You may remember this device under a different name. If you do, I apologise for bringing back memories you have rightly suppressed. Depending upon the region, the Grandstand Light Games was released as the Playtime Products Light Games Color LCD Projector, the Fantastico Projector Mega Video Game Color LCD System, and even more ridiculous names for what was basically a torch. Okay, it's a bit more interactive than a torch, but not by much. Around 13 games were made for the unit, and they were of course simple LCD games that you could project onto a flat surface. Well, we say could. Really, you had to project them. There was no screen on the device itself, meaning if you didn't have an empty white wall and enough distance in the room for the projector to work properly, the unit became a luminous paperweight. While the ability to play games on your wall was a bit of a novelty, the technology of this device was well behind the times. For some context, the very next handheld console released was the Game Boy, and I don't think they ported Super Mario Land to this. Number 64. Tiger R-Zone, 1995. Technically, the R-Zone is more of a head-held, but we'll cover it here anyway. The device took all of the fun of Tiger's LCD games, that is to say, no fun whatsoever, and put it on a screen that you belted to your head. It's like wearing a monocle, except that people realise even more quickly that you're an idiot. Were the games good at least? Could you perhaps play R-Type on the R-Zone? Not a chance. This thing couldn't handle noughts and crosses. The games were the same kind of basic fare Tiger had been making for their dedicated handhelds and digital watches for years, only now they were displayed in searing red and projected directly into your cornea. Later versions were more like traditional handhelds, but that didn't help matters. The games were awful, and even their licenses, from Batman to Jurassic Park to Mortal Kombat, could not save the R-Zone. Nobody wanted it even after they stopped making you strap it directly to your eyeballs, which is probably saying something. It retailed for only around $50 in today's money, but I'd be willing to blind you and make you look foolish for even less, so drop me a line. Number 63. Goldstar GPi-1200, 1997. The Goldstar GPi-1200 was... Wait a minute. I recognise this. This is... Oh Christ, this is a Philips CDI! Come on man, I thought we were done with this abomination! Don't ask me why, but a number of different manufacturers produced their own versions of portable CDI units, including Sony, who probably treated it better than they treated the Vita. Oh. We're using this entry as a sort of catch-all for the various portable CDIs, but it's worth noting that most of them never made it to the consumer market. This Goldstar version did, at least briefly, meaning kids could finally get their Hotel Mario fix on the go, and then almost certainly swear off video games forever. On the bright side, the CDI library had nearly 200 games. On the less bright side, they were CDI games. The device weighed more than 4 pounds, meaning it would certainly have served as a murder weapon at some point if anyone had purchased one. The price was $1,900 in 1997. That's not adjusted for inflation. When we do adjust for inflation, it's around $3,100. And what a coincidence. That's exactly the amount of money you'll have to pay me to speak about the CDI ever again. Number 62. PALMTEX Portable Video Game System, 1984. The PALMTEX Portable Video Game System is the only console on this list to have been sold exclusively via mail order, but that was not the original intention. What's more, it didn't sell under the PALMTEX or Portable Video Game System names at all. PALMTEX got a taste of video game revenue by importing Nintendo's Game & Watch units from Japan and selling them in North America. It was a fruitful relationship, but before long the company started to wonder if they could design a system of their own. The eventual result was the self-explanatory Portable Video Game System. PALMTEX had demonstration units available just in time for the Consumer Electronics Show in January 1984, an event that would go on to break attendance records. They failed, however, to find a distributor, and PALMTEX defaulted on its loans. Another company named Home Computer Software bought the stock, renamed the system the Super Micro, and sold it through the mail to recoup its investment. It was a quiet, undignified end for what could have been quite an interesting system. Only around 5,000 units were sold and a mere 3 games were made. It's an oddity, but a fascinating one in just about every way. Number 61. VTECH Variety, 1983. Hey, do you want to make your handheld console impossible to research in a few decades? If so, take a page from the VTECH Variety and name it after a common word that people will use when discussing pretty much any topic. Here's a list of potential console names to get you started: the color, the play, the unit. VTECH naming their handheld the Variety makes it extremely difficult to find information, and if it weren't for a few scant photos of the thing, hey, That's another thing you could name your impossible-to-research console. The Thing. We'd have assumed it never existed, and honestly, it might as well not have for as little as it had to offer. The variety was basically a plastic shell into which you could slot little handheld LCD games. They were exactly the kinds of games you could buy as separate, dedicated handhelds, but now they didn't come with buttons. Progress! Nobody seems to know what it cost, how many units it sold, or when it was discontinued, but it couldn't have done that well. Look at it. Bright yellow. Guaranteed to be struck down before its time. Number 60. Tiger GIZMONDO, 2005. The GIZMONDO was the product of circumstances so bizarre we literally cannot even scratch the surface here. Instead, picture the absolute craziest thing you can imagine, and know that whatever you pictured is nowhere near as crazy as the actual circumstances surrounding the GIZMONDO. Tiger Telematics, not to be confused with Tiger Electronics, the other Tiger on this list, expected the system to be huge. In fact, when GIZMONDO launched in the UK, they opened a flagship store on London's Regent Street. Here's evidence, if you'd like to post it to any of those cursed image groups. It was home to extravagant parties featuring rock stars such as Sting, who I assure you has never so much as uttered the word GIZMONDO. In the US, it sold mainly at mall kiosks, a risky move considering human beings have an inborn aversion to making eye contact with anyone working at mall kiosks. For the equivalent of around $300, you could buy a GIZMONDO that periodically served you advertisements. You could purchase a version without ads for the equivalent of around $530. Tiger never activated the ad function though, meaning that anyone who bought the ad-free version essentially flushed an extra $230 down the toilet. The system sold fewer than 25,000 units and the company lost an impressive $382.5 million. Number 59. Entex Adventure Vision, 1982. An early colour handheld in the sense that red is a colour, the Entex Adventure Vision launched with the only 4 games it would ever get. Entex pulled the plug after about a year without releasing any of the planned peripherals. The unit ran at a neither silky nor smooth 15 frames per second, using a technically impressive but realistically cumbersome series of red LEDs and spinning mirrors to project its image. This is similar to what would eventually be used by the more successful Virtual Boy, and the Adventure Vision should feel pretty awful that I was able to use the phrase the more successful Virtual Boy. Its pack-in game was Defender, which was one of the most popular arcade games of the era, but not enough people wanted to play it on what was essentially a light bright. Sales figures are hazy. Some claim that the Entex sold 50,000 units, while others claim that they only manufactured 50,000 units. Still, other sources put the number of units made at 10,000. In any of these scenarios, the Adventure Vision was not a success and is a rare find on the collector's market, which is good because I don't want you to buy one. Number 58. Entex Select-A-Game, 1981. The Select-A-Game achieved infamy from the very start. One of Entex's first games for the unit was Space Invader 2. Notice how similar that title looks to Space Invaders when you see it on the label. Midway, indeed, sued for copyright infringement, but lost on the grounds that arcade games and handheld titles were works in different media, and therefore it didn't matter how similar the two names were. This was clearly idiotic, but it was symptomatic of games being both so new and so far from the established precedent. Emboldened by their successful rip-off, Entex released Pac-Man 2, not even trying to hide behind similar names anymore, instead just slapping a number on the end. This time, justice was served. Entex would have to discontinue the game by the end of the year and had to pay all profits to Coleco, which owned the Pac-Man license. With a lifespan of just over a year and only 6 games available for the system, the Select-A-Game left more of an imprint on copyright law than it did on handhelds to come. But it's at least why Microsoft can't make a game called Super Mario Kart 2 and get away with it, so there's that. Number 57. VTECH 3D Gamate, 1983. The name of the console is meant to be a portmanteau of game and mate, I have to assume, but it doesn't sound like that, does it? Anyway, VTECH's first attempt at a handheld console did little to move games forward. In fact, it took familiar LCD technology and simply held it closer to your eyes. The device presented 2 slightly different angles of the same image, creating a rudimentary 3D effect. Of course, none of its games was of the sort that would benefit from 3D, meaning that the only advantage this offered over existing handhelds was that you'd look much sillier while using it. Sales figures are not available, but we can't blame VTECH for that. I likely wouldn't brag about them either. Sources seem to agree that it must have been discontinued quickly, however, as only half of its planned 6 games were released. The 3D Gamate is at least significant for being the first 3D handheld with interchangeable cartridges. It's also, however, the one most likely to permanently blind you if you trip while playing it. Number 56. VTECH PROSCREEN, 1984. Hold on, didn't we just talk about this? Yes, also no, but yes. The VTECH PROSCREEN isn't quite another iteration of the 3D Gamate, but it is an entirely separate device released the following year that happened to play the same games. We can't hold that against them, of course. Backwards compatibility is a welcome feature of any console, and surely they didn't want to leave behind the 3D Gamate's robust library of 3 games. It was a toss-up as to whether we should rank this higher or lower than the 3D Gamate, as no sales figures or pricing information is available for either of them. We decided to favour this version mainly because the games didn't benefit from the 3D functionality of the other system, whereas the ProScreen actually did add something interesting, the ability to project the games onto a wall or other large surface. In the days before televisions had screens of decent size or picture quality, playing video games with a large display was genuinely innovative. Even if the games were terrible, like just utter rubbish, irredeemable crap even. The ProScreen was very cheaply made, so finding one in working condition isn't likely. Thank Christ for that. Number 55. LG KidsPad, 2012. The KidsPad is another handheld we haven't found much information about. LG released the device exclusively in its native South Korea, so details are written exclusively in a language I can't read. Sales figures are not available, but the KidsPad launched with only 2,000 units, and I can't find any evidence that more were ever made. Perhaps that represents great sales in the South Korean children's educational handheld market. Perhaps it doesn't. Who's to say? Someone from South Korea probably, so not me. It was priced at around $315 when adjusted for inflation, which was pretty spicy compared to other educational handhelds. I can find almost no information on the games that were made, and also very little footage of anybody actually playing one, but it did seem to have some nice features such as a light sensor, a camera, and MP3 playback capabilities. LG also emphasized the KidsPad's durability, meaning it could strike the floor over and over again without sustaining damage, so I suppose it also functions as a stress reliever. Do I know that for sure? No, I don't know anything about the KidsPad, and even after listening to this entry, neither do you. Number 54. KOEI PASOGO, 1996. Normally we wouldn't include a handheld on this list if the only thing it could do was play Go, but the KOEI PASOGO actually does qualify as a console, as it had 11 different games released for it. All of them were different versions of Go, but you had to buy them separately, so here we are, talking about a handheld that only plays Go. Hooray. In a way, this makes sense. KOEI could cater to a smaller audience of Go aficionados with a less expensive unit dedicated entirely to their hobby. There was just one problem. The thing cost almost $400 when adjusted for inflation, significantly more expensive than the more versatile handhelds. I don't know much about Go. I do know that Googling it is a flipping nightmare. Maybe the PASOGO is the single greatest thing to happen to Go since the letter G, before which the game was only called O. Maybe this handheld was excellent and anybody who did not own one was mocked ruthlessly and pelted with Go pellets, or whatever those things are called. All I can say for sure is that if I had gotten one of these for Christmas as a kid, I'd be an even grumpier adult today. Number 53. LEAPFROG IQUEST, 2001. It's difficult for us to rank educational consoles on the grounds that we don't need no education. The LEAPFROG IQUEST, however, is one we feel comfortable keeping toward the bottom of the list. I'm sure it's not terrible, but it also doesn't do much of anything. Also, for a handheld console made in 2001, this feels remarkably primitive. Of course, the iQuest was not designed to compete with games consoles. It's a portable study aid and only ends up on this list through technicality. At the same time, though, it's entirely text-based and doesn't do much other than roll through sets of study questions. Different subjects were available on cartridges, which seems like a big step backward in an era during which study aids would have been available online for no charge. Sales figures are not available, but I have reason to believe the LEAPFROG iQuest didn't manage to outsell the Nintendo DS. Also, an obtuse interface makes the unit's alarm functionality needlessly confusing if this YouTube comment from 2016 is to be believed. Shed a tear for Hovannes Dermovsician, who was still being woken up several times per week by his 15-year-old iQuest. Oh no. Number 52. MGA Game Wizard, 1994. By 1994, you'd think the games industry would be keeping decent records, and you would be right! Good for you, you handsome genius! Even so, nobody seemed to think it was worth documenting anything to do with the MGA Game Wizard. Maybe it's because its technology would have been out of date a full decade prior. Maybe it's because you couldn't buy additional games for it without buying a completely new unit. Maybe it's because every game played just about the same as any other, so getting 3 in a pack didn't feel like the bargain it should have. The Game Wizard was little more than a cheap toy attempting to ride on the popularity of the properties MGA licensed, such as VR Troopers, Power Rangers, and yes, Star Wars. Does that mean we forgot about these, or did we intentionally leave them out of our every Star Wars game ranked from worst to best lists just to see who was paying attention? We forgot them, okay? But look at these things, you can't blame us. The Game Wizard was distributed by Grandstand in the UK, but Grandstand already had a handheld called the Game Wizard, so they rechristened it the Game Player. Wow, with exciting names like that, it's a wonder these things didn't fly off the shelves. Number 51. GiochiPreziosi My Life, 2007. Have you ever wanted a Tamagotchi of yourself? Are you a little girl? Unless you've answered yes to both of those questions, the My Life is not for you. GiochiPreziosi marketed it as the first console designed entirely for women, which is true as long as you don't count the 3 consoles designed entirely for women that preceded it. Operating under the assumption that girls don't like video games unless they're pink and bad, the My Life is a strange handheld, revolving almost entirely around a single life sim experience. Additional game cartridges were released, 3 by our count, though we only need 1. Mainly, you were expected to purchase magic keys, which allowed you to access clothes, accessories, and features that were built into the console. On-disc DLC? Boy, am I glad that never caught on. The system saw some degree of success in its native Italy, selling about 1 million units, but it didn't fare as well in other regions, spending less than 1 year on shelves in America. It was followed up by an improved version called the My Real Life, adding a camera and MP3 playback, but it was somehow less successful than its predecessor. Number 50. M&D Monon Color, 2014. Chinese toy company M&D released their Monon Color in 2014. I'm assuming it's pronounced Monon. It might be Monon, I don't know. It was their first proper handheld console, though they did flirt with the concept a few years prior with their Dream Dragon, which used trading cards and badges instead of cartridges. The Monon Color is more traditional, and also, to be honest, quite a bit more boring. It was significantly outdated by the time of release, but it did have one thing going for it: its price. The Monon Color launched at the equivalent of about $17. Yes, $17. Since it wasn't much of an investment, maybe M&D thought more people would take a gamble on it. Sales figures are not available, so it's possible they were correct, but the company announced plans to release a new game every month, and it looks like only 20 games in total ever came out for it, so perhaps not. Some of the games came from large franchises such as Roko Kingdom, Dragon Ball, and even Marvel, but the Monon Color seems to have had little to no presence outside of China. Which means nothing, as Wish and AliExpress will try to get you to buy one the next time you log into Facebook. Number 49. Mattel Children's Discovery System, 1981. You've seen many educational consoles on this list, and our list of every console ranked from worst to best for that matter, but we'd bet most of them would be vague about what they actually promised parents. Not so with the Children's Discovery System, which promised a smarter child in 60 days or your money back. Sales figures are not available, nor are refund figures, but after 3 years on the market, Mattel liquidated thousands of remaining units and games, so we'll assume the Children's Discovery System at least didn't meet the company's expectations. The unit itself is not all that impressive, and truth be told, it wasn't all that impressive in 1981 either. It had only 21 games and sold for more than $350 when adjusted for inflation, so it was never really an appealing product for children or parents. There is one standout feature of the console though. It had its own programming language. Kid Basic allowed youngsters to write their own programs for the Children's Discovery System and potentially create their own games. I mean, the games would look like this, but still, cool concept. Number 48. Time Top Game King, 2003. The Time Top Game King seems to have existed only to trick people into buying it. It's designed to look physically like a Game Boy Advance, right down to the thing including cosmetic shoulder buttons, but when you boot it up, you'll see that the games are far below the standards of the original Game Boy. Maybe I should say if you boot it up, as it doesn't seem many people did that. Sales figures are surprisingly not available, but surely anyone who actually played this in 2003 would still be laughing to this day. Nobody seems to know precisely how many games were released for the Game King, but there appear to have been around 50, all of which were the stuff of flu-induced nightmare. There's a game called Duckman with a man who is clearly not a duck. There's a game called Penguin with box art stolen from National Geographic. There's a game called Dracula Zone that is about surfing. At least, I think it's about surfing. I can at least promise it's not about Dracula. Then there's the Super Mario Bros. Clone with the incredible title Adventure Legend Carlo. If your party isn't this lit, don't bother inviting me.
Number 47. Ohio Art Etch-a-Sketch Animator 2000, 1998, not 2000. You're almost certainly familiar with the Etch-a-Sketch. It was an art toy that everyone was better at playing with than you were. Ohio Art dreamed up a fair few versions over the years, including the Etch-a-Sketch Animator, which allowed children to draw up to 12 frames of animation, pixel by pixel. 1 year later, we got the Etch-a-Sketch Animator 2000, which combined its animation capabilities with those of a game console. The device is fascinating in retrospect, if only because of its striking similarity to what Nintendo would do with its DS 16 years later. 2 screens oriented vertically, with the lower one being a touchscreen controlled by a stylus. Of course, the Etch-a-Sketch Animator 2000 did not have anywhere near the success of the DS itself. Sales figures are not available, but it seems to have been discontinued within a year of its introduction, after only 3 games were released for it. Its price surely didn't help things. It sold for upwards of what is $300 today, significantly more expensive than the previous version of the animator. It was an interesting concept, but not one the public was interested in, at least not back then. Number 46. VTECH V.SMILE Pocket 2005. As if the handheld scene wasn't filthy enough, with the Nintendo Switch having cardboard peripherals that are basically called labia, VTECH released a handheld in 2005 called the V.SMILE Pocket. That is absolutely disgusting. The V.SMILE Pocket is another educational unit from VTECH with dubious educational value. It was designed for children between 5 and 8 years old, which is perfect because a 9-year-old is certain to realise that this thing is crap. Even putting aside the smut, the name itself is inaccurate now I think about it, which is not a great start for a device that's supposed to teach your kids. I suppose it might fit in your pocket if you're a kangaroo, but it certainly won't make you smile. Around 35 games were released for the V.SMILE Pocket, all of which were understandably simplistic. They didn't come on cartridges though, no sir. To emphasise the educational nature of the handheld, these games came on smartridges. VTECH even trademarked the word so that nobody else could call their cartridges smartridges, and I assure you VTECH, nobody else wanted to call their cartridges smartridges. It was originally released in orange and purple, but a pink and purple model eventually came out, allowing girls to finally play it as well. The unit was designed to be inexpensive, selling for around $120 in today's money, but it struggled to sell even at that low price, and was eventually reduced to the equivalent of just $25, simply to get rid of the stock. Oh, more like the V-Frown Pocket. Number 45. LEAPFROG Digi 2008. LEAPFROG is known for their educational consoles, and the Digi, which has a name that I genuinely hate saying out loud, is indeed one of those. This one had some rare appeal for older consumers as well though. It ran on Linux and sold for around $100 when adjusted for inflation, making it an early and inexpensive way to create a dedicated emulation handheld. And while we are not by any means suggesting that one system should be hacked to play emulated games from another system, we are saying that we can't blame anyone who did it with the Digi, because its actual games were bad. Only around 16 were released, and reviewers criticised the unit for running all of them poorly, with freezing and unexpected rebooting being a common issue. The unit suffered from poor battery life, lasting only around 2 hours on a full charge, and it also suffered from overheating, so thinking about it, maybe it was a good thing your child couldn't play it for very long. It saw some decent third-party support, but is also home to Sonic's absolute worst game, which I suppose is an accomplishment in itself. It says a lot when a game's official commercial makes it very clear that it plays terribly. Number 44. Bandai Design Master Denshi Mangajuku, 1995. That name just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Bandai Design Master Denshi Mangajuku was not a success. Something tells me you could have guessed that on your own, but it is a genuinely interesting piece of technology. It's one of the earliest consoles centered around a touchscreen, for instance. As such, much of its intended appeal came from art programs. In fact, you could actually connect game cartridges to design cartridges and import sprites that you've created into the game you're about to play. Now, if that seems far too advanced for 1999, that's because it was. The import functionality was limited, and the games, due to the touchscreen interface, were all menu-based. The Design Master Denshi Mangajuku did not impress many people, and only 9 cartridges in total were released for the system. Amusingly, there were more variants of the handheld than there were games. This included a version marketed towards girls called the Pelusiata, I think, and a limited edition Mega Man X3 version, which Bandai hoped would turn the Design Master Denshi Mangajuku's fortunes around. Perhaps because nobody in their right mind wanted to play Mega Man X3 as a visual novel, the gambit failed and the unit was discontinued after only 1 year. Number 43. Nico Digiblast, 2005. The Nico Digiblast was developed in the Netherlands, a region so named because they should never develop a handheld console ever again. Oh, I'd kill me. Anyway, seemingly designed to look like it could only be safely handled by robots, the Digiblast was launched to no acclaim for no real reason. It did have some multimedia capabilities, allowing parents to purchase episodes of cartoon shows on cartridge, but only 20 games were ever released, and at most 100,000 Digiblasts ever sold. The unit could be connected to a television if you wanted to watch your TV shows on an actual TV screen, but at that point the Digiblast is just a cumbersome middleman, or middlewoman. You could also play its games on your TV, of course, but then you'd be subjecting your entire family to the Digiblast library rather than keeping it to yourself, and I assure you they do not deserve to be disrespected like that, except maybe the parent who chose to buy you this in the first place. The failure of the Digiblast is sometimes attributed to a chip shortage that made it too costly to produce, but considering nobody was buying this thing in the first place, I find that very difficult to believe. The device was discontinued after about 1 year on the market, and nobody cried. Number 42. Nintendo Pokemon Mini, 2001. Pokemon is huge. Nintendo handhelds are huge. Put them together and you get this, I guess. It's fine. Now, it is technically a handheld console, I assure you, but I think we can all agree that it was more of a toy, and it was priced accordingly. At under $60 when adjusted for inflation, the Pokemon Mini console was less than the price of a new game at retail right now. Then again, you would almost certainly enjoy the new game at retail more than you would this thing. A total of 10 titles were released for this, all having to do with Pokemon. By that I mean they carried the name Pokemon, not that they were comparable in terms of gameplay, quality, or even enjoyability. They were mainly mini-games and puzzle games, but one title, Pokemon Tetris, was actually pretty good, because it was Tetris. That's the only reason why. Sales figures are not available in this case, which is a rarity for Nintendo. In fact, they even released sales figures for the Virtual Boy. If they're happy to talk about those, but are keeping quiet about how many Pokemon minis they shifted, we imagine it did not do well. For whatever reason though, this handheld has found a minor second life on the homebrew scene, which I guess is good. Keeps them out of landfill, I suppose. We're very eco-conscious here at Triple Jump. Number 41. Fisher-Price Casey the Kinderbot, 2002. Listen, I would not talk about this terrifying thing if I didn't have to, but Casey the Kinderbot technically qualifies as a handheld by the rules we established for this list, so just shut your eyes if you have to. On a related note, I have now fired the person who established the rules for this list. Casey the Kinderbot is a robot that gyrates and never shuts up, but does so in the name of education, so apparently it's okay. He's really quite creepy, and I really don't appreciate that he's looking at me like he's about to offer me a drink after I already said no. Because life is suffering, Casey the Kinderbot was followed by other iterations, including Toby the Totbot and Fetch the Phonics Bot. Casey and pals won several Toy of the Year awards, presumably because all the other competition mysteriously vanished the night before the ceremony. Casey the Kinderbot accepted cartridges, and probably accepted other things too, which contained different lessons and games centered around various subjects, such as science, reading, foreign languages, and why machines are superior to weak, foolish humans. That last one didn't sell too well, but was clearly the subject about which Casey the Kinderbot was most passionate. Casey was removed from the market by a time-travelling super soldier named John Connor after thousands of Kinderbot units mistook their children for simple sentences and violently broke them down into their constituent parts. Number 40. RomTech ColorVision 1984. Depending on where you were located, you might have known the ColorVision as coming from a different company, such as Altic, Bazin, or Bristol. Depending on when you were born, say any time after 1984, you might not have known the ColorVision at all. Sales figures are not available, but the console's rarity on the second-hand market suggests it didn't sell all that well. That is slightly surprising to me, actually, as the games were about on par with the quality of other handhelds of the era, and they looked significantly better. True to its name, the ColorVision presented its otherwise standard LCD games in full colour, with some genuinely lovely artwork in every cartridge. And I do mean that the artwork is literally in the cartridge. Light shines through a plastic screen from above, illuminating the backgrounds and objects onto a mirror in the system. It was not especially advanced for its time, but the games being in colour helped them to pop and gave them each a more unique identity than most black and white LCD games. The ColorVision was unquestionably a failure, but it was a charming one, and that's more than I can say for any of my failures, let me tell you. Number 39. Hartung Game Master 1990. When taking on the Game Boy, Hartung had an exceptional idea: sell it in places that were not already overrun with Game Boys. As such, the Hartung Game Master was distributed in its native Germany and then in France, Italy, and the UK. Once again, you may have encountered it under a different name, which is likely repeated in your nightmares to this very day. The console was sold as late as 1994, but that could just be because it sold so poorly that Hartung was still offloading its stock 4 years later. 19 masterful games were released for the Game Master, and as you might have guessed, they were unofficial clones of other games such as Tetris and Space Invaders. Weirdly though, despite sharing a name with a Nintendo title, Urban Champion is not a clone at all. It's a case of parallel invention, meaning that technically, Hartung is exactly as creative as Nintendo. These games also seem to have been carelessly made, with titles often being different in the game than on the box. You know, I'm beginning to suspect that Hartung were only in it for the money and weren't passionate about game development at all. Number 38. Tapwave Zodiac 2003. Fittingly sharing its name with a notorious serial killer, the Tapwave Zodiac seems to have been released only so people could eventually include it on lists of the worst consoles ever made. It made next to no impression in the marketplace, sold fewer than 200,000 units, and caused a global sigh of relief when it was discontinued about a year and a half later, because humanity was no longer in any danger of accidentally buying it. Tapwave did their best to stir up interest, announcing ahead of release that the Zodiac had 1,200 developers who would make games for it. Only 46 games were ever released though, so we think they might have been a little over-optimistic. However, in a puzzlingly fawning review, Pen Computer magazine gushed over its features, the inevitability of it changing the face of electronics as we knew them, and its only downside, which was a lack of feet, meaning we were unable to get down on our knees and kiss them. Here's an actual quote that's aged about as well as a bottle of milk curds sitting on a sunny windowsill. "A Zodiac 1 is a quantum leap beyond those wimpy plastic Game Boys." For even more context than you need, the Game Boy Advance was on the market at this point, and more of those were sold in the time it took me to read that quote than the Zodiac sold in its entire life. Number 37. VTECH Precomputer 1000, 1988. The VTECH Precomputer 1000 was an educational console, which means it had some of the greatest games ever made. Oh, sorry, I got confused for a minute there. It was an educational console, which means its games consisted of spelling lessons and Bible trivia. This is another case of sales figures not being available, but the Precomputer, which you should never abbreviate as Precom, by the way, seems to have sold decently. It cost around 133 of those adjusted for inflation dollary dues, which is fair for a learning tool. Even if it only taught kids to type, which it would thanks to its QWERTY keyboard, that could be considered a fair investment. The unit had games and utilities built in, with 7 more available on cartridge. It also included Pre-Basic, a programming language, but considering the screen could only display 20 characters at a time, and all programming was lost every time you changed the batteries, it's safe to say that kids weren't doing much more than getting it to display the words "Hello World" or "Precom." VTECH did bring out an improved version known as the Precomputer 2000 in 1992, 3 years after the 1000 was discontinued, and this new unit could display 2 lines of text instead of only 1. Truly, the future had arrived. Number 36. Bandai Digi Casse, 1984. Bandai entered the handheld market with the Digi Casse, a device with interchangeable LCD screens. Each of the games used the same controls, obviously, but different iterations of the Digi Casse had different styles of input, with some featuring a tiny thumbstick and others directional buttons. It's a strange system and not one that gets much attention, which is a polite way of saying we were able to dig up jack squat about it. A total of 10 games were released for the system, which isn't many. But Bandai's marketing of the Digicasse was smart. Instead of simply selling it with or without a pack-in game and letting consumers do the legwork, the system was sold in different packages depending upon one's interest, each of them coming with the handheld itself and 2 games that shared a theme. If you liked sport, like Ben Potter, Oh Yeah, Here We Go, etc., you could buy one that came with football and tennis. If you liked cartoon characters, you could buy one that came with 2 colourful mascot games. And if you liked historical tragedies, you could buy one that came with a game called Mount Fuji Explosion. Like I said, it's a strange system. Number 35. Watara Supervision, 1991. Fancy a game of Christ Ball? Well, brother or sister, pick up a Watara Supervision and enjoy its pack-in game. Just as an aside though, it's spelled like this and so has nothing to do with Jesus, and it's a crap version of Arcanoid on a terrible screen, so let's maybe not play Christ Ball, actually. I'd rather go to actual church. The Supervision was designed to compete with the Game Boy, no prizes for having guessed that, and was actually a decently made unit. It was sturdy and, well, it was sturdy. That's more than most of the Game Boy's competition can actually say. It also sold for significantly less, around $95 when adjusted for inflation. Its library consisted of 69 games. Oh no, keep it down, Christ might still be listening. Literally none of which are worth the time it takes to drop them in the bin. In fairness to Watara though, it really was the weakness of the games that let the supervision down. Selling what was more or less a comparable unit for a fraction of the Game Boy's cost was a fair way to try and get a piece of the action, and seems to have made some degree of impact in Italy for whatever reason, but nowhere else. Weirdest of all though about this system is that the supervision is named after one of the least fun words in a child's lexicon. Maybe that's what scared people off. Number 34, Tiger Gamecom, 1997. We will give Tiger credit here for improving on the R-Zone. They'd have to have worked pretty hard to do any worse, but still, credit where it's due. The Gamecom never stood a serious chance of making a dent in the handheld market, but it did feature primitive internet functionality, and its stylus-based app-like interface is something we've seen in far more successful contexts since. The system certainly wasn't helped though by how far it tried to reach. No handheld in 1997, for instance, was going to play Resident Evil 2 competently, but Gamecom had a port. Ditto Duke Nukem 3, Sonic Jam, and even Mortal Kombat. They were all tied for being the worst things imaginable. There were even plans for Metal Gear Solid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night to be ported to this thing. Can you imagine playing Symphony of the Night on a Gamecom? It would be like playing Uncharted 4 on an abacus. A later version, the Gamecom Pocket Pro, was far superior to the original handheld, but I've known things that have curled up and died behind the fridge in that house at the end of the street with all the old newspapers and jars of piss in the window that were superior to the first Gamecom. All told, this system sold fewer than 300,000 units, and those consumers formed a support group in 1999 that still meets regularly to this day. Number 33, the VTECH InnoTab, 2011. VTECH released several different versions of its child-friendly InnoTab, all of which were ostensibly educational. I say ostensibly because I've been playing this SpongeBob dancing game for 60 hours straight and I still haven't learned a bloody thing. The InnoTab started at around $150 in today's money, which was certainly a safer investment for your kids than a shatter-prone iPad would have been at the time. Games were available at both retail and through digital download, but the latter seems to have been lost to time. There were only around 15 titles released at retail, but that likely was just a small fraction of what was actually available. The games seem to have been simple overall, and there were also digital storybooks that were intended to help children learn to read. However, I've been playing this SpongeBob dancing game for 61 hours straight now, and I still can't read. Critics were not impressed by the lack of responsiveness in the touchscreen, the system's sluggish performance, and the poor audio and video quality. We've already seen the handhelds that those critics had as children though, and really guys, you have got no room to complain. Number 32, Fisher-Price Pixter, 2000. Initially released by Fisher-Price, the Pixter soon moved over to the parent brand Mattel. As such, depending on the model, you might see either company's branding on it. The real story here though is the name of the system itself, never mind the branding. Why does it sound like a slur, you filthy Pixter? The change from Fisher-Price to Mattel was almost certainly made to expand the console's audience, but that might not have been the best idea. The Pixter was very clearly designed with young children in mind. Children who were old enough to hold a stylus without sticking it down their throats, yes, but still young-ish. Its games would have bored anyone older than the Fisher-Price target audience, as they all ran at the speed of your dead grandmother. As might be expected for an early touchscreen device, the majority of the Pixter's 60 titles were minigame collections that saw you tapping on things, dragging things, and wishing Nintendo would hurry up and invent the DS already. Children likely got more enjoyment out of the artistic side of the device, which allowed them to draw, colour, and even take photos. A later multimedia in air quotes version allowed kids to toy around with clips from Dora the Explorer and SpongeBob the Sponge, but only 6 cartridges were ever released. On the bright side, only 6 cartridges were ever released. Number 31. Tiger Video Now XP 2005. Perhaps it says something that Tiger's best handheld console is the one that was least like a handheld console. That's not to say it's good, but the Video Now XP at least did what consumers expected it to do. In the early 2000s, media players were a novel concept, especially if they could handle video. There was also little in the way of an established standard, meaning manufacturers were trying to push their own formats and/or copy protection. Video Now was Tiger's attempt at both under its parent company Hasbro, and the Video Now XP was the portable device that could play the unusually small discs. Tiger got buy-in from a number of established shows, including Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Danny Phantom, Peanuts, Kirby, and even Mr. Bean. Not the good Mr. Bean, the naff animated Mr. Bean that ended up on Worst Games Ever, but you know, still Mr. Bean. So hang on a minute, let's backtrack. Why are we actually talking about this? It's just a media player, right? Well, no. Games were also available. Only 3 of them, and they were all FMV games with less interactivity than even Night Trap, but they did exist. Batman, Teen Titans, and Scooby-Doo were all carved up into quote-unquote games that asked you to press a button at the correct time in order to see the next clip. Oh, thrilling. Incidentally, Tiger Video Now sounds like someone who barely speaks a word of English asking you to send them cat memes, and that mental image is more entertainment than I would ever get out of this device. Number 30. Nokia N-GAGE 2003. Because it's been a little while since we had an entry that you've actually heard of. The Nokia N-GAGE attempted to lure gamers away from other handhelds by being a really crap handheld itself, but also a phone. Given that you've got a really crap handheld that's also a phone in your pocket right now, that wasn't really such a bad idea, but the unit saw negligible success in its 2 years on the market. Criticism was levied at, well, just look at it. Playing games that required any sort of reaction or dexterity on the part of the player were uncomfortable at best and next to impossible at worst. Though Nokia absolutely intended for the unit to function as a handheld, its primary design considerations treated it exclusively as a phone, meaning consumers ended up with this strange sort of device that wasn't especially desirable for either purpose. It was also ruddy expensive, selling for more than an adjusted 420 Blaze It bucks. It did have almost 60 games available at retail and a surprising amount of support from Sega, but that was less a compelling reason to own an N-GAGE than it was evidence that Sega had literally no idea what they were even doing anymore. Number 29. Wellback Mega Duck 1993. If it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably not anywhere near as good as the Game Boy. The Wellback Mega Duck, which I think should have been called the Super Duck, wore its aspirations on its sleeve, designing its unit to look as much like Nintendo's as either company's legal team would allow. Sales figures are not available here, but we can't imagine anyone other than confused parents took one home from the game shop. In a way, that's disappointing. The games were actually better than most other Game Boy pretenders had on offer. There were only 24 of them, and even the best of them wouldn't have held a candle to anything Nintendo or Sega were releasing on their handhelds, but they were competent enough. Unfortunately though, Wellback seemed to believe that the key to success was to not advertise it anywhere, under any circumstances. As a result, nobody in the entire world knew it existed or spoke about it until this list was made. In their press release announcing the Mega Duck, Wellback executives cited the console's educational benefits, but having looked through the system's library, I think the only thing it could have taught people was how to be more careful with their money. Number 28. Game Park GP-32 2001. Many consoles, handheld and otherwise, were created mainly to compete with Nintendo. In the case of South Korea's Game Park 32, however, there was no competition. Due to restrictive trade laws, electronics from Japan were not legally available. There was certainly high demand for handhelds, but the most popular ones simply couldn't be imported. Enter the GP-32, which was funded by the South Korean government to generate money for the country. It sold for the equivalent of $320 today and only had 28 games released for it at retail, but the GP-32 was open source, possibly due to a lack of large developers in South Korea, deliberately courting bedroom coders and indie developers who could release their games digitally on the system. Popular homebrew games were even available for download from the official Game Park website. Of course, where there's homebrew, there's emulation as well, which made the unit a popular pickup when it was available. Ultimately, however, the embargo on Japanese electronics was lifted, and the GP-32 could no longer compete. The system was released in a few more countries just to test the waters, but a government-produced handheld with fewer than 30 games did not topple the world's most recognizable publisher. Go figure.
Number 27. Epoch Game Pocket Computer, 1984. The Game Pocket Computer by Epoch was well ahead of its time. That was almost certainly the reason for its downfall. In 1984, this simply was not like any other handheld on the market, and consumers were skeptical. Sales figures are not available, but no reliable source describes it as anything other than a failure. Only 5 games were released for the system before it was discontinued, and none of them are particularly unique or interesting. But the Game Pocket Computer was more powerful and technologically advanced than any handheld gamers had seen yet. It sold for a fair price, it was well constructed, and a full charge would give it an incredible 30 hours of playtime. The system is a fascinating failure, and I think part of that failure is due to its size. Despite its name, the Game Pocket Computer doesn't fit in a pocket at all, and without ease of portability, it was likely to stay in the home. 1984 also saw the second generation of home consoles enter full swing, a generation that included the NES, Master System, and the Atari 7800. If the Game Pocket Computer was going to stay in the home, it simply could not compete with that. Number 26. VTECH Mobi Go, 2010. The VTECH Mobi Go was not terrible, making it a genuine rarity in the educational console market. It isn't great, and I'm not advising you to stop watching this video so you can rush to eBay and buy one. In fact, please don't do that. We worked very hard on this video and I will miss you, but it was a fully competent device. It featured both a touchscreen and a slide-out keyboard, which is such a smart concept for an educational handheld that I'm shocked more of them didn't do it. The Mobi Go helps children to develop both their motor functions and their typing skills. At least we assume that's the case. It would all come down to the kinds of games available and how effective they were at conveying their material. There's little information about them, however. There seems to have been around 10 released in total. There are racing games and rhythm games, which probably offered some nice variety, but wouldn't help Junior do much better on their exams. Still, the unit sold for around $70 when adjusted for inflation, meaning if your kid got any educational benefit from it at all, it was money well spent. Number 25. Bit Corporation Gamate, 1990. When Atari, Sega, and NEC tried to unseat the Game Boy, they did it by manufacturing hardware far beyond Nintendo's system. When Bit Corporation tried to unseat the Game Boy, it basically made the Game Boy, but worse. The Gamate, which oddly is not related in any way to the Gamate 3D we discussed earlier, was released worldwide in what must be one of humanity's greatest moments of unfounded optimism. It suffered all of the limitations of a Game Boy, the small screen, the motion blur, the kidney disease color palette, and had none of its advantages. There isn't any reliable data on how large the library was, but there seems to have been at least 72 games released, nearly all of which were simple clones of better games you would rather play elsewhere. The one advantage the Gamate had was its price. Adjusted for inflation, it sold for around $140, quite a bit less than its competition, but buying an expired tin of beans for $5 when you could have had a steak for $7 doesn't necessarily mean you've gotten a good deal, does it? Number 24. Nintendo Virtual Boy, 1995. We love Nintendo, how could we not? Even their failures are adorable, and the Virtual Boy, let me be very clear about this, was indeed a failure. It's not quite as bad as its reputation suggests, but that's only because its reputation suggests that it damned all of our souls to an eternity as Satan's roommates. It's still quite bad, and we ranked every one of its games from worst to best to prove it. Watch that when you're done here. Touted as Nintendo's foray into virtual reality, hence the name, it really just presented reinvented traditional gaming experiences in 3D. The library included puzzle games, sports games, and platformers that weren't presented any differently than they were on consoles, aside from the fact that they were all the same color as your eyes after 10 minutes of playing them. We're classifying it as a handheld because that's how everybody seems to classify it, but really you're supposed to put it on its stand, step back several feet, and pelt it with rocks. Nintendo did manage to sell almost 800,000 of these things, and we hope all 800,000 of the people who bought them got the help they so clearly needed. Number 23. Milton Bradley Microvision, 1979. You are looking at the very first handheld console, at least as far as we're defining them. Dedicated handhelds for single games predated it, but for the Microvision, Milton Bradley took a cue from the home consoles that were gaining traction at the time. Instead of building and selling one-off games to customers, the company could sell one console and as many games as they liked for years to come. It might sound like an obvious idea today, but in 1979 it was a big risk. Who would want to carry around a handheld and a library of games? Didn't that defeat the convenience of handheld games in the first place? No. As it turns out, the Microvision was a success. Reliable estimates place Milton Bradley's profits from the device at around $8 million, the equivalent of around $28.6 million today. Because the company had experience designing hardware that would only work with one game, the Microvision doesn't actually have a CPU. It's essentially a controller with the hardware for each game built into its cartridge. And how much did those cartridges cost? A mere $20, or $71.57 when adjusted for inflation. I don't want to hear you complaining about paying $70 for a PS5 game ever again. Okay, well, a little bit. It's expensive. It is expensive. Number 22. Tomo Neo Geo X, 2012. A Neo Geo unit that isn't by SNK? That's sure to be good. The Neo Geo X is what we'd now call a mini console, but it offers something most other minis do not, a cartridge slot. Though this system came with only 20 games pre-installed, 5 additional cartridges featuring more games were released. This, and I wish to be very clear, was an excellent idea. The reason I want to be very clear about that is that none of its other ideas were excellent, unfortunately. It was surprisingly expensive, around $230 when adjusted for inflation. Even worse is that there is nothing proprietary about the technology at all. It runs an imperfect emulator that is available online. The games didn't even look particularly good. Reviewers complained of imperfect scaling and washed out colours, problems that became even more obvious if you plugged it into your television. Are the critics just being big fat babies? Perhaps, but SNK themselves weren't impressed either. A year after its debut, they publicly accused Tomo of releasing a product that was not up to the standards associated with the Neo Geo name and insisted they discontinue it and remove all existing stock from shelves. Still, mini console with an expandable library. Let's get more of that, please. Number 21. Nvidia Shield Portable, 2013. Nvidia's attempt to make it in the handheld console market seems to have been more of an experiment than a serious direction for the company. Their primary attention remained on the other products such as graphic cards and tablets that kept them afloat. In fact, Nvidia never officially announced the product's discontinuation, preferring to let it quietly die. It's still a quite interesting device, however, not least because it's a strong first showing for a company that hadn't made any other handhelds before. Its screen was great, still is to be honest, and the fact that it essentially holds a console quality controller built into it meant it felt good to hold and play. Of course, this high quality craftsmanship came at a cost, about $340 when adjusted for inflation. That was money that an enthusiast might have been happy to pay, but the general consumer would not have taken the risk. Those who did own it enjoyed it, especially since it had an Android operating system and was therefore quite versatile. It also had access to any game designed for Android and was able to stream games from your PC. It was a strong first showing. Number 20. Fisher-Price IXL, 2010. An educational handheld/media player for young children, the Fisher-Price IXL is not a bad unit at all. It offered kids a safe electronic device that could download a large variety of games through the official website. That's a straightforward statement, I would have thought, but the official website bit is actually what makes the IXL notable for the wrong reasons. An educational company called Kia Corp had been producing online learning materials since 1998. In 2007, they launched an educational sub-series called IXL. It was so successful, the company changed its name to IXL in 2010, shortly after Fisher-Price released its IXL handheld. The company took Fisher-Price to court for Google confusion, arguing that people searching for IXL learning materials would be directed toward Fisher-Price's toy instead. And though the company had only recently started going by the name IXL, those letters had been associated with their product for years. The case was ultimately settled in Fisher-Price's favor on the grounds that trademark laws protect against mistaken purchasing decisions and not against general confusion due to coexistence. And yet we had to change our channel's name a matter of days after launching it. Justice for some, am I right? Number 19. Atari Lynx, 1989. Pity the poor handheld to release immediately after the Game Boy, because no matter what it would be, it wouldn't stand a chance. That ill fortune fell to the Atari Lynx. About 4 years earlier, Nintendo unseated Atari as the kings of the console market with its superior hardware. Atari could have gotten its revenge here, unseating Nintendo as the handheld king with its superior hardware. After all, in a technical sense, the Lynx is absolutely to the Game Boy what the NES was to whatever console Atari was trying to sell that week. And yet, the Lynx was a failure, selling only 3 million units. There are many reasons for this. It was more than twice the price of a Game Boy, its battery consumption was absurd, and you'd be imprisoned for murder if you dropped it on anybody. Ultimately though, we think it came down to the games. The Lynx had nothing that could compete with Nintendo's pack-in, the legendary Tetris, for sheer addictiveness, and that never changed during its 6-year lifespan. It received only 76 games, many of which were downgraded console and arcade ports that were outdated before the Lynx was even in development. Number 18. LEAPFROG Turbo Twist, 2000. The LEAPFROG Turbo Twist combines the fun of learning with the catharsis of smacking your console when you're doing poorly. Taking a cue from Hasbro's Bop It, the Turbo Twist encourages kids to smash it, twist it, and, well, that's about it really, but it's certainly more engaging than studying with a pencil and paper. There were also several Turbo Twist units released, focusing on spelling, maths, and brains. Though it's not immediately apparent, and though they weren't strictly necessary as the unit came with preloaded content to keep most kids busy, the Turbo Twist accepted cartridges. Additionally, you could load your own content onto the device. This obviously wasn't bad for an educational handheld shaped like a... You know what? I won't finish that thought. LEAPFROG doesn't seem to make sales data available for any of its consoles, but it's sold for the equivalent of around $60 today, which isn't too bad, and it seems to be remembered fondly enough by those who had it growing up. Of course, the fact that anybody could be said to have been growing up in the year 2000 is making me feel extremely old, and I think I need a lie down.
Number 17. LEAPFROG Leapster Explorer, 2010. We just can't get enough of educational consoles here at Triple Jump. At least, that's what you'd think, considering we've taken the time to rank every single one of them. So what is this thing? The Leapster Explorer? Well, it's wonderful, a truly fantastic unit. I almost returned my PS5 when I discovered it. Alright, I'll review it properly. This is yet another handheld from LEAPFROG, and it was well received by parents and critics. It's a sturdy device that features both a touchscreen and tilt controls, which is good because kids are probably the only ones who could possibly enjoy tilt controls. Games were available as downloadable apps, which the Leapster referred to as leaflets. That's presumably supposed to be a portmanteau of leap and applet, but it just comes across as more of an attempted pun on leaflet, which is bound to confuse the target audience. What is with these educational consoles and their made-up words? Just teach kids what things are actually called, you fools. In any case, the Leapster Explorer had around 50 games and sold for the equivalent of about $80. So you could do much worse, both in terms of variety and value. If I were 4 years old, I'm sure I'd be thrilled with this. Number 16. NEC Turbo Express, 1990. You may have thought that the first handheld to play actual home console games was the Sega Nomad. In reality though, it was the Turbo Express, which played PC Engine games, or TurboGrafx-16 games if you want to get American about this, on the go. Not every PC Engine game worked, mind you, as they came on a variety of formats, but anything that released on a Who card would run on the Turbo Express, giving the handheld a library of nearly 300 100 games, all of which were home console quality, because, you know, they actually were home console games. Sadly though, the device was too far ahead of its time and failed to be a success, due in large part to its astronomical price tag, nearly $500 when adjusted for inflation. And weirdly, while a console's launch price is usually its highest, NEC increased the cost of the Turbo Express a year after it had been released. That probably didn't earn it much goodwill. The system also suffered from technology that wasn't quite where it should have been, with sound and visual failure being all too common. Still, it was a fascinating bit of kit, with an accessory that turned the Turbo Express into a portable television. Very impressive for 1990. Unless you asked people in 1990, I guess, since none of them wanted it, apparently. Number 15. LEAPFROG Leapster 2003. If you're looking to buy yourself a good educational console, you can't do much better than the Leapster. Also, if you're looking to buy yourself a good educational console, you're far too young to be on this channel. Switch it off now! But do subscribe so you can watch all of our videos when you're older. LEAPFROG is one of very few companies that have managed to carve out a sustainable presence in the educational console space, with the Leapster and its revisions being especially popular. This is no doubt due to the fact that it's inexpensive, around $180 when adjusted for inflation, and features a library of child-friendly games. Granted, there are only 50 games in that library, but that tends to be the number available for any educational handheld. And besides, the Leapster isn't meant to be played for a lifetime, it's meant to be played until you've mastered your alphabet and animal facts. For instance, did you know that ducks are allergic to cinnamon? Well, if you'd had a Leapster, you'd know that I'm actually talking out my arse and just made that up. Again, kids, switch off if you're still watching. We use a lot of words that the Leapster won't teach you, like arse. Number 14. SNK Neo Geo Pocket 1998. The Neo Geo Pocket, as a 16-bit system, outstepped the Game Boy in terms of power and performance, and it sold for less, around $110 in today's money. So of course, in the same month of its release, Nintendo dropped the Game Boy Color, and the monochrome Neo Geo Pocket looked immediately outdated. It was as good as dead, with only 10 games in its library. But SNK was smart. Rather than sink more money into its dying system, they replaced it with the Neo Geo Pocket Color. This was again more powerful than Nintendo's equivalent, and it's the version of the Pocket that SNK gave a global release. They also swelled the library with nearly 100 games in recognizable series such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Fatal Fury, Metal Slug, King of Fighters, and more. It was poised to be a solid rival until the very next year when SNK's parent company decided to shut down global distribution. Nintendo's Game Boy Advance was on the horizon, and again, the Pocket would be outdated and overshadowed. It had a rocky 3 years on the market, selling only 2 million units worldwide, and has the sad distinction of having been assassinated twice by Nintendo. Poor Neo Geo Pocket. Number 13. Sega Nomad 1994. Sega launched its own portable home console in 1994 with the Sega Nomad. It was essentially a handheld Sega Genesis, and yes, despite being a British boy, I will say Genesis instead of Mega Drive here, because the Nomad never released outside of America. The company had high sales expectations, and they weren't entirely unfounded. The Sega Mega Jet, which was a version of the Mega Drive that could be rented before flights, was popular in Japan. In all, though, the Nomad only sold 1 million units and was considered an abysmal failure. Why? Well, the Sega Saturn released a year earlier in Japan, so this wasn't quite the console Americans were saving their money for. They weren't actually saving their money for the Saturn either, but you get the point. With the Nomad, Sega repeated many of the mistakes it had made with the Game Gear. It was expensive, it ate batteries like they were the most Moorish of Fox's biscuits, and it weighed more than the Earth itself. It was an interesting idea though. It could play nearly the entire Genesis library. It didn't support the Sega CD or 32X add-ons, but I honestly consider that a bonus. For some reason though, it just seemed like nobody was really interested in a portable home console. At least not until Nintendo did it, when suddenly it became such a good idea because, now I can play Mario while adrift in the middle of the Atlantic. Thanks, Nintendo! Number 12. Cybiko 2000. For its time, the Cybiko, made by Cybiko, was an impressive piece of technology. It allowed for wireless text communication between units, MP3 playback, and complete PDA functionality. It was also able to access the internet and use email, but could only do those things with a physical connection. And of course, it played games. The unit was aimed at the teenage market, who Cybiko rightly predicted might enjoy texting each other. Unlike most other ahead-of-its-time handhelds on this list though, Cybiko actually appears to have done quite well. Sales figures are not available, but we do know that at least 500,000 units were sold in the system's very first year. Overall, reception was positive. The main complaints were the limited range of the wireless functionality, the extremely small keyboard, and the simplicity of the games. There were at least 430 of those games available though, so at least Cybiko fans didn't want for variety. So what ultimately caused the death of this system? The world may never know. One of life's great mysteries. It was mobile phones though, the world knows that quite well. Phones came down in price and did everything the Cybiko did better and more easily. Still, it was an interesting device and one that is remembered quite fondly. And hey, my phones in the early noughties definitely did not have 430 games available, so you'll always have that, Cybiko. Number 11. NEC PC Engine LT, 1991. Oh, bless NEC. They really thought they were onto something with this handheld home console idea. Shortly after the launch of the Turbo Express, they tried another approach with the PC Engine LT. This version had a clamshell design to keep the screen safe, and it accepted PC Engine peripherals, meaning it could play the entire 700-game home console library. You could even connect a controller if you found the built-in controls uncomfortable. It was also, however, hideously expensive, selling for the equivalent of around $1,100 today. That's more than twice the cost of a Turbo Express, which was itself already causing anyone who saw its price tag to drop dead on the spot. In complete fairness to NEC, the cost was understandable. The technology here was genuinely impressive, and it had by far the highest quality screen of any handheld on the market. But of course, when it comes down to choosing between having a handheld console and being able to afford to have a child and live in your own house one day, the console is probably going to suffer. Sales figures are not available, but it performed poorly enough that any plans for a Western release were scuppered. It has since become a sought-after item on the collector's market though, and for once, I can see why. Number 10. Evercade 2020. The newest handheld on this list, the Evercade, made by Evercade, was designed entirely to cater to fans of retro gaming. It's especially nice for those who aren't comfortable with emulation, as the ports on the Evercade are fully licensed official releases. The unfortunate thing is that the handheld does not support direct arcade ports. Instead, arcade games are represented by their usually inferior console versions. That's not necessarily a deal breaker though, especially when you consider the system sells for a mere $80, and each cartridge available represents a collection of games, often from major studios such as Atari, Interplay, and Namco. In fact, there's around 200 games available for the system at time of recording, and they're spread across only 17 releases, making it easy to collect the whole lot. That's honestly not bad for its first year on the market. Early reviewers criticised the system for lackluster emulation and an inability to remap controls, but Evercade heard and responded to these concerns through firmware updates. The company has already earned a reputation for being receptive and responsive, and a potential successor that supports games from later generations and hopefully the arcade has the potential to rank even higher on this list. Number 9. Bandai WonderSwan, 1999. It takes a thief to catch a thief, as they say. Demonstrably false, but they still say it, idiots. Anyway, the point is, if anyone had a shot at taking down the Game Boy, it would be a man who helped develop it. Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo in 1996 and soon started to lead development of the WonderSwan for Bandai. Tragically though, he didn't live to see how the system turned out, as he was struck and killed by a motorist in 1997. 2 years later, the WonderSwan was complete and released in Japan, where it did shockingly well. By some estimates, it captured as much as 8% of the handheld market, which may not sound impressive, but considering Nintendo's dominance, that was a significant chunk. It was a decently powerful system that ran on a single AA battery, could be played either horizontally or vertically, and had a library of around 200 games. It even featured impressive third-party support, with games from the Final Fantasy, Mega Man, and Clock Tower series all putting in appearances. There was even a puzzle game called Gunpei, named for the console's fallen designer. It sold around 3.5 million units before being discontinued in 2003. Number 8. Sega Game Gear, 1990. Arriving almost exactly 1 year after the Lynx hit shelves, the Game Gear was in a good position. It had seen what Nintendo had been doing for the past year with its Game Boy, it had seen where the Lynx went wrong, and Sega's own Mega Drive had established the company as a serious competitor in the industry. Enter the Game Gear, which sold at a significantly lower price than the Lynx, had a much larger library, and featured games starring beloved characters, such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic Spinball, Sonic Chaos, Sonic Labyrinth, Sonic Blast, Sonic Drift, and probably some other games as well, who knows. Fans responded positively to its colour screen, at least until anything began to move, at which point the games looked like somebody had sneezed them onto the unit. It did have fans though, which put it at a major advantage over the Lynx. Still, the system was a distant second to Nintendo. Sega claims that 14 million units were sold, but that's a far cry from the Game Boy's 118.6 million units. The Game Gear is often considered a failure as a result. Is that fair? Not really, but when you're that far behind the winner, even a second place finish can feel like a thrashing.
Number 7. Sony PlayStation Vita, 2011. Oh, the Vita. The only handheld console that tears open old wounds just by being mentioned. Sony created what is still one of the most advanced and powerful handhelds ever, and then spent its entire life pretending it didn't exist. It was puzzling to say the least, especially since Sony had the good fortune to release the handheld at precisely the moment every other company had been waiting for, a significant stumble for Nintendo. That company's 3DS flopped out of the gate, and Sony responded by expending less effort than you're expending in watching this video. They gave Nintendo plenty of time to get the 3DS back on track and leave the Vita in the dust, which it did, selling around 76 million units compared to the Vita's 15 million. Sony steadfastly refused to support it and may have restricted its success from the start by requiring the purchase of expensive proprietary memory cards as opposed to the more common SD cards. It was a stroke of greed that made the Vita a less appealing purchase up front. As a piece of hardware, it had serious potential. Sony, for reasons we cannot begin to fathom, squandered every last bit of it. We're sorry for making you relive the trauma. I love my Vita. I was playing it in bed last night. Oh, F. Number 6. Nintendo 3DS, 2011. Well, speak of the three-dimensional devil. After years of dominating the handheld market, Nintendo must have gotten complacent. Either that or they hit their heads really, really hard. The 3DS released with a massive price tag, around $290 when adjusted for inflation, and no games. Well, not literally, but when you release with Pilot Wings Resort, yet another port of Rayman 2 and whatever Steel Diver is, you might as well have no games. Critics were impressed by the 3D effect and the potential of augmented reality, but when you couldn't do much more than pet a Nintendog with it, they found the system difficult to recommend. Then, Nintendo did what Sony didn't. They fixed it. They dropped the price, fast-tracked development on major titles, added a virtual console, basically everything they should have done in the first place. The 3DS did not reach the heights of the DS that preceded it, but it sold admirably and was backwards compatible with that system's library. Nintendo has had some major successes over the years and some high-profile failures, but this might be the only time they truly turned one into the other. It was a remarkable comeback, and the system deserved it. Number 5. Sony PlayStation Portable, 2004. The PlayStation Portable, or PSP if you want to get time sensitive about this and then squander the time sensitivity of how you're being time sensitive about this by explaining how time sensitive you're being about this, was Sony's first attempt at a handheld console, and compared to some other first attempts on this list, we have to say it was a darned good one. It was priced significantly higher than its competitor, the DS. The PSP was around $350 when adjusted for inflation, with the DS only being around $200, but it had an excellent launch, with its entire stock in the UK selling out within 3 hours. Critics found fault with it, the buffoons, mainly due to the ease with which its screen could be damaged. That was one area where the DS was clearly superior. They were also baffled by the plastic sandwich that was the UMD when cartridges had been the more convenient norm for handhelds. But no amount of griping undid the fact that the PSP had games that Nintendo simply never would, with installments in series such as God of War, Jak and Daxter, Metal Gear Solid, Persona, and more. The PSP had a total of about 1,700 games and was supported for a full decade. With somewhere around 80 million units sold, the PlayStation Portable is the 10th best-selling console ever and the best-selling handheld that was not made by Nintendo.
Number 4. Nintendo Game Boy, 1989. This is it. The entire reason anyone even talks about handheld gaming today. The Game Boy was and remains one of the industry's finest accomplishments. As we've seen, handheld consoles predated the Game Boy by a full decade, but never before had they been able to offer experiences as long, as deep, or as impressive as those that the Game Boy did. It was closer to what the NES offered than anyone could have rightfully expected, and it introduced several new franchises that outlived the little guy, such as Kirby, Shantae, and Pokemon. It also gave us handheld adventures in established series, such as Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania, and just about anything else that was even remotely relevant at the time. Also, we hear Tetris was pretty good. Of course, it had a tiny screen, issues with motion blur, and could only display the colours you'd find on a dehydration chart, issues remedied by the Game Boy Color and Pocket variants, of course, but that ultimately didn't matter. It established Nintendo's dominance in the handheld space, and that's a dominance that continues to this very day. It sold just under 119 million units in all, making it the second best-selling handheld console ever. Number 3. Nintendo Switch, 2017. Well, if it isn't our old friend the Nintendo Switch on our handheld consoles list. I haven't seen you since we ranked every home console. Doing well, I see. Number 3 on this list. Well, you have been moving up in the world. Yes, complain if you must, and I get it, you must, but the Switch is both a home console and a handheld, so it gets a spot on both lists. If that angers you, just pretend we're focusing on the Switch Lite, which is entirely handheld, and if you're still upset, I don't know, maybe talk to a doctor. Nintendo's hybrid console was exactly what the company needed after the long, painful demise of the Wii U. It showed that Nintendo could still innovate and bring unique ways of enjoying games into homes all around the world. As we've seen, Nintendo has a near-perfect understanding of how to make handhelds. Merging that side of their business with the home console market was a very savvy move then. It wouldn't have meant much if the games had suffered for it, of course, but with releases like Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey, it's clear that Nintendo's games are as reliably brilliant as ever. In addition, you can play The Witcher 3 in a public toilet now, if you want to. That alone deserves some pretty high marks. Number 2. Nintendo Game Boy Advance 2001. Nintendo must have been pretty hesitant to leave the original Game Boy behind. It was a literal worldwide phenomenon, but there came a time that they simply had to move on. Enter the Game Boy Advance, which did not eclipse the Game Boy in sales, but did so in every other regard. It was less expensive at launch, around $150 when adjusted for inflation. It had a game library that was larger by about a third. It was more powerful, it was more convenient, and the games, oh well. The Game Boy found its success in large part because it was home to installments of beloved franchises, even if those installments were nearly always a bit lacking when compared to their console counterparts. The Game Boy Advance, however, saw installments that were so good they're still considered series highlights. The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap, Metroid Fusion, Mega Man Zero, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, Advance Wars, Wario Land 4, the list goes on. As rightly adored as the Game Boy was, the Game Boy Advance simply allowed developers to do so much more, and they rose to the occasion. With around 1,500 titles in its library, it has both more and better games than almost any other handheld in gaming history. Pick one up if you haven't already. Just make sure you get the Advance SP with a backlight. The games are even better when you can actually see them.
Number 1. Nintendo DS 2004. Everything about the DS positioned it for success. It had a fair price, only around $200 in today's money, backwards compatibility meaning the entire GBA library was available to newcomers, and it launched with installments in franchises such as Pokemon, Metroid Prime, and Mario. The dual screen design opened new possibilities to developers, and though many of them just slapped together some touchscreen minigames, there were notable exceptions to the disappointing rule. It offered unique experiences that simply were not possible anywhere else.
It's difficult to remember at this point how much of a risk the DS really was. With the GameCube struggling, Nintendo needed a hit. In fact, prior to launch, former Nintendo president and chairman of its board of directors told the newspaper Nikkei that if the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell. Now that may sound dramatic, but it can't have been far from the truth. Fortunately for him and the rest of Nintendo, they escaped damnation. The DS was a success, selling almost 155 million units worldwide, which is more than all but one other console in history. The PS2 outsold it, but only by a relatively small 1 million units.
It's the best handheld of all time, and it looks likely to stay that way. So did Nintendo rise to heaven? We can't promise that, but they did rise to the top of our list of every handheld ranked from worst to best. I think we can all agree that that's the higher honour.
And that's our list of every handheld ranked from worst to best. How many of them have you accidentally misplaced? Which one did your grandmother mistakenly buy for you when you asked for a Game Boy? Do you think the Switch has killed handheld gaming as we know it? I can't hear you if you answer those questions out loud, so be sure to type your responses in the comments below.
Also, if you have suggestions for other every X ranked from worst to best videos, let us know, as this video proves badger us enough and we'll cave eventually.
You can follow Triple Jump on Twitter here, and while you're at it, why not support the things you enjoy by having a look at our Patreon. Finally, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'm Peter.
And I'm Ben from Triple Jump, and thanks for watching.